On the night of October 14th, 1949, a Friday colder than the calendar had promised, the sidewalk on Main Street in Carroll, Iowa, formed a line that was neither for the movies nor for church. The scene carried something of caution and necessity. People in worn wool coats, some in overcoats already shiny at the elbows, hats pulled down to their ears, hands buried in pockets, all facing the lit display window of Harkin Appliance Radio. Electric light cut the glass against the dark street, and the reason was simple enough to explain the wait. Inside, behind the newly cleaned pane, a television was on. It was still a rare thing outside the big cities, and, in the countryside, more often seen in advertisements than in real operation. But along with curiosity came an equally simple risk, understood by everyone without anyone needing to say it. All it took was a week of gossip, a late bill, one wrong shove, and a small town would start treating a family as if it were a walking warning. That same night, 12-year-old Tommy, Lila Jensen's boy, held her elbow tightly, as if the whole world could be lost if he let go. Lila did not want to be there. She wanted to be at home, with the kettle on the stove and the radio turned low, the way it had always been, with sound coming from familiar tubes and a routine marked by supper and bedtime. But Harold had already said the store needed traffic, that rent did not wait, that the future came with cable and tubes, and that the display window was the only place in Carroll where that future could be seen without paying admission. If it worked, the store could breathe. If it failed, it would not be only money that went away. It would be reputation, and reputation in a small town was the hardest thing to recover because it spread across grocery counters, church pews, and cafe tables, and then never quite returned to its place. The street was damp, smelling of crushed leaves and gasoline, with asphalt and gutters holding the day's water and the wind carrying exhaust from the cars still circulating before night closed in for good. The Carroll Theater marquee blinked farther down, offering a Saturday Western, but curiosity seemed to have changed address and concentrated on the store's glass. In the window, besides the television, there was a Hoover vacuum, a chrome toaster, and a fan no one turned on in that cold. Lined up like Postwar promises, domestic comfort, electricity for everything, the sense that a house could be easier to keep. Harold Harkin, in a white shirt with sleeves rolled up and suspenders, moved behind the counter as if he were in an oversized kitchen, adjusting the set's knob, tugging the cord, tapping the side lightly as if it were a conversation between old acquaintances, the typical gesture of someone who had learned from tube radios that sometimes a contact fails and the world comes back with a touch. The television was a Philco, bought with a loan from Carroll Trust and Savings Bank at the end of September, paperwork that required signature and collateral, brought from Des Moines in a pickup with a tarp over it, as if it were a delicate animal that needed protection from dust and road rain. It had cost more than Lila usually admitted out loud. It had also cost a promise. If it did not pay off, they would sell the car, because installments and interest were not paid with hope. Outside, the line had its disguises and its truths. Some people pretended they had passed by accidentally. Others came straight to it, bodies leaning forward as if the window pulled them. The children were the most honest. They pressed their noses to the glass, leaving marks the cold helped set. Adults kept a respectful distance, as if the novelty required etiquette, and as if getting too close might look like need. On the screen, a man in a dark suit spoke quickly, but the image shook with stripes. The improvised antenna, fastened with tape and a piece of wire, did what it could to reach a signal coming from so far away it felt almost indecent to believe. In Carroll, in 1949, the most likely signal to be caught on good nights came from Omaha. On others, something from Sioux City might appear, and on bad nights, it was only snow and a crooked line, the visual hiss that even had a name among those who tried. Even so, When the man's face stabilized for a few seconds, a sigh ran through the line like a wave, and the silence that formed was the kind heard in church when someone holds their breath, as if everyone were confirming, at the same time, that it was real. Lila watched the people more than the screen, because that was where she could see what was at stake. She saw Mrs. Doherty from the laundry, eyes narrowed like someone calculating cost and benefit, used to adding pennies on soap and steam bills. She saw the Miller brothers, who had a farm to the north, leaning on a pole, laughing softly and saying it was big city stuff, as if distance were a defense. She saw the assistant pastor, hands clasped, as if weighing a threat, not to the device, but to habit. She also saw Dolores Klein from the beauty salon, who did not hide her jealousy. Dolores had a new radio and thought that was modern enough, and the idea of someone having a box that showed people moving felt like a personal affront. When Dolores looked at Lila, her eyes carried a wordless question. How much did it cost? And who was going to pay for it? Harold opened the door once, letting out warm air and the smell of heated metal, of dust burned on a resistor, and of counterwood that spent the day under lamps. "Come closer, if you want," he said, in a voice practiced to sound casual. "Just don't touch the glass, it fogs." He did not add what he truly needed, that these nights become a tradition, that the store be more than a place to buy an iron. The post-war years had filled shelves with things, but had not filled everyone's pockets. Farms still depended on weather. Bills still depended on the price of corn, and money came and went with harvest, feed, fuel, and maintenance. And Main Street, which during the war had been only work and rationing, now wanted entertainment. But entertainment that did not require gasoline to Des Moines, at a time when driving far was still a calculated decision, with cost and time. The week before, Harold had hung a hand-lettered sign, "Window nights, live TV, Fridays and Saturdays, 7 p.m. The words live TV were generous. It was live when it came in. Even so, that Friday the street divided into small clusters, as if along invisible borders. There were those who came hungry for novelty, those who came to police it, those who came to laugh if it failed. And there were those who did not come, and made a point of saying on Sunday that it was indecent, people standing on the street as if they had no home, as if the sidewalk were a place for idleness and not for passing through. Lila's son Tommy did not blink. His face reflected the screen's bluish light, and Lila felt a stab of fear she could not name. It was not fear of the device itself, but of what it changed without asking permission. Until then, nights in Carroll had sound and smell. The radio in the kitchen, the creak of floorboards, wind tapping the window, coffee dripping. People went out to church, to the Lions Club meeting, to the school game in the gym. Now a box could hold everyone on the sidewalk, in silence, looking inward as if the world outside were less real, and that disturbed an order that seemed natural only because it was repeated, as if repetition were proof that nothing could change. On the second Friday of window night, October 21st, the cold came earlier and the line came bigger. Harold had gotten a small electric heater and placed it near the door, more to give the impression of hospitality than to warm anyone, because cold air came and went with each opening. The news had traveled as far as Glidden and Arcadia. A couple from Glidden parked a Ford with dirty plates and stood at the end of the line, speaking softly about buying a set when it came down, as if the price were a tide that would someday recede. The window that night showed a boxing match for a few minutes, a shaky picture, but enough to make the boys from the garage let out shouts. Tommy went home with an electric body, repeating punching motions in the air, and Lila had to tell him twice to wash his hands before supper, because excitement came with a hurry that did not match a set table, and she felt again that the novelty did not stay outside. It came in with people. It was also that week that a deeper discomfort began, because curiosity was no longer only curiosity. It was becoming competition. Mr. Rusk, who sold furniture, began saying the window was drawing people who ought to be looking at sofas. Dolores commented loudly at the salon that women were now crowding the street instead of taking care of the house. And a rumor, small but persistent, began to circle. Harold was charging something on the sly. Harold was using it to sell on credit to people who could not afford it. Harold was getting too big for himself. In a small town, prosperity almost always came with suspicion, as if one person's luck were an accusation against another's effort, and as if any sign of advancement had to be explained by a trick, not by work. Lila felt the weight of it at the market at the end of October, when she picked up sugar and flour, items still bought with attention to price and use, because the pantry was counted. Mrs. Pritchard, who always talked about the weather, suddenly asked whether the set did not give children headaches. Lila answered that Tommy slept fine. Mrs. Pritchard smiled without showing teeth and said she had heard of people in Chicago who got screen sick. Lila went home with bags heavier than they should have been, not from what was inside, but from what came with them, that sense that even what was said as concern could be used as judgment. Harold, for his part, seemed more alive than he had in months. He arrived early at the store, cleaned the glass, adjusted the antenna on the roof with thick gloves, and came back down with red hands marked by cold metal. At night, when the line formed, he spoke little, but his eyes had a shine Lila recognized from when they were newly married, when they opened the store with one shelf of radios and a borrowed counter. He believed it was their chance not to be swallowed by bigger stores in bigger towns. The television, to him, was a window and a lifeline, and the display window was the only place that window could be shown without anyone having to sign an installment book, without the promise of the future coming with the humiliation of admitting they could not pay. On Sunday, October 30th, 1949, after service at First United Methodist Church, the subject drifted through the coffee hall like smoke, mixed with the smell of weak coffee and plain cakes served on paper plates. Some said it was wonderful, that it seemed like magic. Others said it was an invitation to laziness, that families would stop talking. An older man, who had lost a son in the war, commented that he had already seen too much novelty for one lifetime. No one mentioned leaders or politics. The discomfort was domestic, intimate. It was about where people placed their attention and what they stopped doing while they watched, and about what entered the home without being invited, as if the door were open not to a neighbor, but to an entire world. On the first Friday of November, the fourth window night coincided with an important Carroll Tigers game in the gym, and that exposed the division more clearly. Boys who would normally have been at the game stayed on the street, wanting to see whether the television would show something real. Mothers who usually took children to the gym were torn. The gym was noise and familiar faces. The window was silence and novelty. Lila, who always helped set up chairs at the school, saw fewer people show up. The music teacher remarked that the children were singing less and imitating the voices from the screen more when the screen appeared. The sentence was not an accusation. It was a record, like someone noting a change in wind direction, not yet knowing whether a storm was coming, but feeling the air was no longer the same. On Saturday, November 12th, Harold decided to do something that seemed harmless and would become the moral catalyst of this story. He announced that if the signal came in, he would leave the television on later for those getting off work. The idea was good for the store, but it disturbed the collective rhythm. Main Street, which usually emptied early, gained a second life, with footsteps and voices where before there had been only the distant sound of cars. The grain processing plant workers who got out late began stopping there. The widow who lived alone on Maple Street began to appear, wrapped in a shawl, because the window was, for a few minutes, a place where she was not alone. And with that came irritations, too. The noise of people on the sidewalk, candy wrapper litter, the feeling the street no longer belonged to those who slept early, and that rest could be interrupted by a novelty no one had voted to accept. That night, the television managed to catch a variety program long enough to show a woman singing and a man telling jokes. The picture was small, but the presence felt large. The children laughed in chorus, and that chorus, heard from across the street, made Mr. Babcock, who lived on the second floor above the pharmacy, open his window and complain he could not sleep. He slammed the window shut. A minute later, someone in the line said it was envy, and the word, tossed like that, became a nail, fixed the idea that the town was dividing not because of a device, but because of what each person saw in another's success. Dolores Klein heard, and the next day commented at the salon that the town was getting ill-mannered. Mr. Rusk said Harold was attracting loafers. The bank manager's wife, who had always been cordial, walked past the store without looking in. And Lila, who until then had only felt discomfort, began to feel an obligation. She needed to protect her husband not only from bankruptcy, but from social judgment that could be as destructive as a flood, because it left no visible mud, but it left a mark, and in a small town, a mark is not washed away with water. On Tuesday, November 22nd, 1949, the first real snow fell. The town woke to a thin layer on rooftops and a white sky, and the street had the silence snow brings, muffling footsteps and engines. Lila spent the day scrubbing the store floor and organizing boxes of light bulbs, while Harold worked through papers and bills, his hand moving from one receipt to another, as if he could order the world into columns. Window nights would continue, he said, because now they were being talked about. And when something becomes talk, stopping suddenly looks like a confession of guilt. Lila realized with uncomfortable clarity that the set had stopped being merchandise and had become a symbol. And symbols are not controlled with receipts or good intentions or the care of cleaning glass. On Friday, November 25th, the day after Thanksgiving, Main Street was full of people who still had the taste of turkey and pie in their mouths, and the holiday had left homes with leftovers and conversations with scraps. The cold was cutting. Breath came out in clouds. Harold taped a paper banner in the window. Happy Holiday, TV Today. The store glowed like an aquarium. Tommy, in a blue knit cap, helped line up benches inside because Harold allowed a few people in when the cold became unbearable, as long as they did not touch the set, as if closeness were a privilege and also a risk, as if one wrong gesture could send the night out of control. It was that night that a group of older boys appeared, coming from the bar near the station. They laughed loudly, shoved one another, and the line, which until then had held a kind of quiet respect, stiffened. Lila recognized one of them, Ray Stinson, in his 20s, big hands of someone who worked with machines. His father had a farm and had not spoken to Harold since an old argument over a refrigerator that broke. One of those arguments that, in a small town, becomes a repeated story and is never fully closed. Ray stopped near the glass and said something Lila did not hear, but she saw the movement of his mouth and the way he tilted his head toward the inside, as if the window were a stage. Harold, inside, pretended not to see, keeping his body busy so as not to give the other the pleasure of a reaction, as if indifference could hold the night in place. The television showed a piece of college football, coming and going as if the signal were playing. When the image held for a minute, people leaned in. At that exact moment, Ray slapped the glass with his palm, not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to make some children jump. Mrs. Doherty stepped back, indignant. Lila left the doorway and went out to the sidewalk, her heart racing. She had no intention of arguing, only of calming things, but her body was tense, And in a small town that is language, the gesture becomes message before the word, and the street reads the body like text. Ray looked at her with a crooked smile. He said something about watching fish in an aquarium. One of his friends laughed. Tommy, inside, saw his mother and ran to the door, but Harold raised a hand for him to stay. Lila spoke in a low voice, asking for respect, asking him not to scare the children. She did not use please as a plea. She used it as a rule, like someone trying to keep a minimum line of civility so everything would not go off the rails. Ray stepped closer, and the smell of alcohol arrived, mixed with cold. He said the street was public. He said no one told him what to do, and the sentence spoken there was not only a challenge. It was a warning that the night could become something else. What happened next was fast, and for that very reason, stayed engraved in small details, as if memory chose what cannot be undone. Mr. Miller, one of the brothers, moved forward and put his body between Ray and Lila, as if separating a cockfight. Ray shoved Miller. Miller stumbled on the curb, hit his hip, and let out a short groan. One of the boys pulled Ray back. The women made a collective sound, half indignation, half fear. Lila felt someone's arm gripping hers, pulling her back. It was Mrs. Pritchard, surprisingly firm, her hand squeezing like someone holding a child near a busy street, as if she knew that from there on, any step could cost dearly. Harold, seeing the commotion, threw the door open and came out. He was not a fighting man, but he was a store man, used to settling things with talk, to avoiding loss with words before it became a hammer. He said something to Ray, still keeping his voice controlled, but his face red. Ray answered with a phrase that made Harold take a step. And then, trying to show dominance, Ray hit the glass again, this time with a closed fist, as if the window were the easiest enemy, as if breaking the barrier were the same as winning the situation. The display glass was not made for that. It cracked in a spiderweb pattern and, in a second, gave way. The sound was loud, sharp, followed by the continuing clatter of pieces falling. People screamed and backed away. A large fragment dropped inward and struck the corner of the counter, shattering more. Harold, too close, raised his arm by instinct. The glass cut the skin of his forearm and opened a deep line, immediately red. The television, on top of the cabinet, shook with the impact and tipped over. The picture tube did not explode, but the set hit with a hollow sound and stopped showing anything. The screen went black, like a closed eye, and the contrast between the store's light and that darkness felt like the future itself retreating, as if the promise had been interrupted mid-sentence. For a few seconds, the world seemed without sound, even though everyone was talking. Lila saw blood running down Harold's arm and dripping onto the floor. She saw Tommy frozen in the doorway, mouth open. She saw Ray looking at his own hand, where a small cut appeared, and the shock on his face when he realized what he had done. No one there wanted to be responsible for something irreversible. Still, the cut, the glass, the fall of the set. Everything had already happened, and what breaks in front of witnesses becomes collective memory, becomes a repeated version, becomes a lesson that is not always fair but is always used. Someone ran to the pharmacy. Someone shouted to call the doctor, Dr. Wees, who lived near the square. Harold held his arm with his other hand, pressing, and Lila pulled a dish towel from inside the store, pressing it to the wound. The white cloth turned red in seconds. Mr. Miller, still on the ground, tried to get up with help, his face tightened with pain. Ray was held by his friends and, for an instant, seemed to want to run, but he stayed, as if the whole street were a wall, and as if running would admit more than what was already admitted by the glass on the ground and the blood that would not stop. Carroll police arrived within minutes, the officer with his coat buttoned to the neck, notebook in hand, and cold air coming in with authority. He separated people, asked questions, looked at the broken glass as if it were a dead animal. Ray was taken away, without visible handcuffs, but with the officer's hand on his arm. The sound of the patrol car door closing landed like a period. The television remained on its side, the dark screen reflecting street lights and the shadows of faces, as if returning the image of those who had come to look, now forced to look at themselves and at what the town was capable of doing when it felt provoked. Dr. Weese stitched Harold's arm in the back room of the pharmacy, under a harsh light that left nothing merciful with the smell of antiseptic and metal. Lila held her husband's shoulder while the needle went in and out. Harold did not cry or complain, but his jaw was locked, as if the physical pain were less than the humiliation of having his store wounded in public. Tommy sat on a high chair, legs swinging without touching the floor, staring at the basin of blood and water. That night, the town did not gain a story of entertainment. It gained a story of injury, and injury in a small town lasts longer than novelty, because novelty passes and the scar remains. The display window was covered with boards the next morning, November 26th. Harold, his arm bandaged, nailed the boards up with one hand, the hammer too heavy for the way he had to hold it, and each blow seemed slower than it should have been, as if his body remembered the crack from the night before. Mr. Miller went to the hospital in Carroll itself, and the news spread that he had broken his hip. A broken hip in 1949 was not like a sprained ankle. It meant bed, it meant time, it meant dependence, it meant pain that did not resolve with 2 days of rest. The Miller family, always self-sufficient, now needed help to keep the farm going. That changed the tone of what people said about the incident. It was no longer only a broken window. It was a man who might never walk the same again, and that carried practical weight, work, and survival, the kind of weight that makes a town lower its voice. The following week, the store was strangely quiet. Without the window, there was no line. Main Street returned to its old rhythm, but with a hangover feeling, as if the street had woken after a bad night and did not know where to put its hands. People passed and looked at the boards as if looking at a missing tooth. Some came in to ask about Harold's arm, to offer soup, to say it was a shame. Others crossed the street to avoid having to talk. Dolores Klein commented that it had been what you always expected, and that phrase made 2 of her customers change the subject quickly, like people avoiding touching an open wound, because the phrase seemed to want to turn accident into destiny, and destiny was a word that removed responsibility from everyone. Harold tried to pretend he did not care what people said, but Lila saw the way he counted the cash drawer more carefully, the way he looked at the broken television in the storeroom, covered with a sheet. The set had been taken to Moyne for repair, but the technician said the tube had taken a hit, that it might not be worth it. Worth was a cruel word when it came to a dream, because a dream does not go into a parts table, and yet it was with that word that reality asserted itself. On December 3rd, 1949, the local paper, the Carroll Daily Times-Herald, published a small note about vandalism on Main Street and minor injuries. The note did not mention names, but everyone knew. The tone was neutral, but neutrality did not erase the shame of seeing one's own street in print for the wrong reason. That same week, Ray Stinson was ordered to pay for the damages and received a sentence that, in a small town, was more social than legal. He had to do community service and make a public apology. His father came to the store with his hat in his hand, looked at the floor, and said he would pay for the glass. Harold accepted, but did not offer coffee. The agreement was made in short sentences, as if any extra word could become a fight, and as if silence were the only way to keep the matter within limits, without letting it ignite the street again. The irreversible thing was not only Mr. Miller's hip, nor the scar Harold would carry on his arm forever, a pale line that would show in summer. The irreversible thing was that television, which had begun as a collective curiosity, had now been marked as a cause of disorder. The town found a way to blame the thing instead of facing what already existed inside it: resentment, fatigue, fear of falling behind. Lila noticed it in the way people began to say that thing instead of television, as if the name gave it too much power, and as if avoiding the word were a way to avoid responsibility, or at least to keep distance from what hurt. Even so, desire did not disappear. It only changed location, like water seeking a crack. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1949, when snow covered the square and the department store lights glowed faintly, someone in the post office line remarked that a cousin in Omaha had a television at home, and now the children did not even go out to play anymore. The sentence was spoken with disapproval, but behind it there was a glint of curiosity. The future had not been stopped. It had only taken a blow, and a blow is not the same as an end. It only changes the rhythm by which things enter life. Harold, his arm improving, decided he would no longer do window nights. He said it one night in January 7th, 1950, while Lila sewed on a button. The house smelled of bean soup. Tommy did homework at the table. Harold spoke as if announcing something simple, like changing a light bulb, but the decision carried weight. He said the store could not be a stage. He said people had to go back to buying what they needed, not what they wanted to see. Lila listened and nodded, though she knew he was giving up not only out of prudence, but out of injury. He had felt, on his own skin, that the town could turn against him over something he believed was good, and that good intentions do not protect against glass, nor against the speed with which a rumor becomes certainty. At the end of January, the new glass was installed. It was immaculate, without marks, reflecting passing cars. The window went back to displaying toasters, radios, a Kelvinator refrigerator. The television, partially repaired, was sold at a discount to a family in Breda, who took the set wrapped up and did not look back. When the pickup disappeared onto U.S. Route 30, Lila saw Harold stand in the doorway longer than necessary, as if watching part of his plan leave with it, carried by a road that linked small towns like beads on a string, each with its desire to move forward and its fear of paying the price. Community life in Carroll did not return exactly to what it had been. Mr. Miller spent months with a cane and never again walked with the same steadiness. His wife began accepting help for things she had refused before, and that changed how people visited, with more care and less pride. Ray Stinson went back to work, but his laughter on the street grew quieter. He began crossing to the other side when he saw Lila. The children, who had felt the electricity of the screen, went back to playing in the snow, but now they played program, imitating hosts they had seen for only a few minutes, as if those minutes were enough to plant a seed, and as if memory were stronger than duration, because a first impression, at certain ages, fixes itself as if permanent. In February 1950, on a windy night that made the house crack, Harold brought a new radio into the kitchen and repaired the old one without hurry, as if he wanted to prove he could still handle predictable things, static that could be solved and a knob that responds. Lila kept making coffee, folding cloths, go to the market, smiling at those who deserved it, and keeping silent with those looking for a fight. Tommy grew a few inches and began looking at display windows with less innocence. The scar on Harold's arm lightened, but did not disappear. It was a line that showed when he lifted boxes, a reminder that a night of curiosity had become a night of glass, and that the body keeps what the town tries to forget, even when the street pretends it has passed. In spring, when the ice melted and Main Street smelled of wet earth again, a small, practical change happened that helped the town recognize itself again, without needing to say so out loud. Mrs. Miller, tired of carrying buckets and pretending she could manage, accepted that neighbors organized to finish planting a section of land closer to the road. The Lions Club announced a work bee on a Saturday in April, and without calling it a campaign or a moral repair, men showed up with gloves. Women brought coffee in thermoses and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Harold went too, his arms still sensitive to long effort, and took on repairing a wooden gate and tuning an old barn radio so the house could have news without climbing stairs. It was not celebrated as a noble gesture. It was treated as a task, the kind done because someone needs it, and because the community, when it wants to, knows how to act without speeches, as if work were the safest way to fit back into one another. On a warm Friday in May 1950, Harold had an idea again, only this time without a window and without a line on the sidewalk. He put a discreet notice on the store door, written in the same hand as the old sign, only smaller. TV demonstration. Inside the store. 15 minutes. Saturdays 4 p.m. There was no live, no promise, no invitation to the whole street. There was only the proposal to come in, see, leave, as if it were any other product. The first Saturday brought little traffic, but no trouble. On the second, a few families came, one at a time, wiping their feet on the mat. The children looked with the same shine, and the adults asked about installments and antennas. But now the sound was contained by walls, and the town did not have to watch itself, or turn curiosity into a public spectacle, or test on the sidewalk how far each person's patience went. Ray Stinson appeared on one of those Saturdays, at the end of June, hair combed and hands steady. He did not come with friends. He entered and took off his hat, as his father had months earlier, and stood near the counter, looking at the shelves as if searching for a safe place for his eyes. Harold did not smile right away. Lila, behind the register with a receipt pad, saw the hesitation in both men's bodies, that kind of silence that in Carroll usually became resentment. Ray cleared his throat and spoke softly, without a rehearsed line, saying the payment for the glass had been made, and yet the guilt had not gone away, and that Mr. Miller did not deserve that. Harold listened without interrupting. After a while, he said only that his arm had healed and that Mr. Miller's hip was what mattered, and that the street had been hard on everyone. There was no handshake that looked like a movie scene. At most, there was a short nod, and the sense that part of the town stopped clenching its teeth, not from complete forgiveness, but from fatigue at holding tension, like someone finally letting go of a weight they can no longer carry. In July, Mr. Miller appeared on Main Street with his cane and a clean Sunday shirt, even though it was Wednesday. He walked slowly to the door of Harkin Appliance Radio, stopped to catch his breath, and went in. Harold came from the back holding a box of light bulbs, and for an instant the two men stood staring at each other, like men remembering the weight of their own body falling on the curb and the sound of glass giving way. Miller said his hip would not return to what it was, but he could now climb 2 steps without help, and the farm had survived because people showed up when it was needed. Harold answered that fixing things was part of the job, whether it was a radio, a refrigerator, or a piece of peace. Miller did not laugh, but his eyes softened. He bought a small fan, a simple thing, and when he left, he made a point of stopping on the sidewalk and looking at the new glass hole, as if he wanted to register that the street could be whole too, and that what breaks can be replaced, even if it does not erase the sound of the crack. By the end of the summer of 1950, the store had not become an attraction, but it had returned to being a place people passed without hostility. Dolores Klein kept talking too much at the salon, as always, but she no longer said that thing with the same venom. The bank manager's wife greeted Lila again at the market and asked about a new electric iron. Tommy, now 13, began working at the store some late afternoons, sweeping the floor and organizing cords, and learned to hold a screwdriver carefully, as if he had understood that certain objects demanded respect, not because of magic, but because of consequence, because what seems like only a thing can become a cause, and a cause can become a wound. When autumn returned and leaves again stuck to the gutter on Main Street, the memory of the window nights still existed, but it no longer commanded the town's mood. It had settled like a scar, present, but not preventing movement. On October 14th, 1950, exactly 1 year after the first line, Harold closed the store at the normal hour, turned the sign to closed, and took Lila and Tommy to the Carroll Theater to see a Saturday movie. At the entrance, the marquee lights reflected in the store glass across the street, and no one stopped to stare as before. Television now was only another piece of merchandise that some homes had and others would still get, without needing to happen on the sidewalk, without the town needing to choose sides, and without a display window needing to carry the weight of a dispute. That night, when they drove home along Maple Street with the car windows fogged, Harold drove with his left arm resting on the wheel, the pale scar showing only when a streetlight hit it. Lila, in the seat beside him, held the folded movie program, and Tommy, in back, already half asleep, had the smell of popcorn on his coat. The house was cold inside, as it always was in October, and Lila lit the stove, put water on to boil, and listened to the familiar ping of heating metal, an ordinary sound that still meant safety. Harold sat at the table and remarked that the bills were up to date, that the bank had agreed to renegotiate part of the loan, and that with summer sales they would not need to sell the car. Lila did not answer with loud enthusiasm. She only nodded, and her nod was enough. In Carroll, in 1949 and 1950, happiness rarely made noise, and when it appeared it usually came like this. In things confirmed, in routines that fit the body again, in neighbors who learned to cross the street without looking away, and Harkin Appliance Radio remained on Main Street with its window hole and its door opening every day, not as the stage of a divided town, but as a place where the future could enter little by little. And where life, despite one night of glass, had found a simple way to go on. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video. It helps these quiet, often forgotten stories reach more people. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered, but we'd also love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans across countries, generations, and experiences, all connected by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.